I didn't expect last night to turn into a mess I'd replay in my head for weeks. Honestly, I thought I'd have a quiet evening to myself. Just me, a cup of lukewarm tea, and some overdue reading. But as soon as my stepdaughter, Emma, and her best friend, Lila, came into the house, all of that went out the window. Emma is 24, sharp, funny, with this way of tilting her head when she's thinking that always makes me feel like she's trying to read me. And Lila, she's the same age but different. More chaotic, unpredictable, the kind of person who can walk into a room and immediately shift the energy, whether you want her to or not. I'd seen them before, of course, dinners, birthdays, brief visits, but last night was different. It started innocently enough. I was curled up on the couch when I heard the door slam. Emma's laugh echoed down the hallway. Lila, trailing behind with her bag, slung over her shoulder. They didn't see me at first. I should have gotten up, made myself known, but something made me stay put, like a moth hovering near a window, curious and cautious all at once. Then it began. The giggles, the whispered plans, the sound of shoes dragging across the floor. At first, I thought maybe they were just excited, pumped from some late-night adventure. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized there was no intention of keeping the volume down. My tea went cold. The pages of my book stayed blank. And somewhere between the kitchen and the living room, I felt my patience fray, just a little. I tried to tell myself it was harmless. They're young, they'll settle soon, I muttered under my breath. But the way Emma and Lila glanced at each other when I emerged from the hallway, like they shared some secret, made my stomach twist. Something was going on, something they weren't ready to explain, and I didn't know if I wanted to ask. Hours passed. The laughter didn't stop. My phone buzzed with messages I couldn't read fast enough. Every time I thought they might finally go to bed, some new emergency or idea or game pulled them back into the living room, and I found myself caught in their orbit, half annoyed, half intrigued, and entirely unable to get comfortable. By 3 in the morning, I realized something unsettling. I didn't just feel like an intruder in my own home. I felt invisible. Emma and Lila weren't ignoring me entirely. It was more like they were performing, daring me to intervene. And I couldn't decide if I should leave the room or stay, silently watching, waiting for whatever they had planned next. When the clock struck 4:17 a.m., I heard it, a laugh, sharp and deliberate, coming from Lila. Emma followed it with a whisper I didn't quite catch. And just like that, I knew this night wasn't going to end quietly. I braced myself, not sure whether to confront them or hide and let it unfold. Because whatever was about to happen next, it wasn't going to let me sleep. By sunrise, the house was quiet, but not entirely. Emma and Lila had finally retreated to the spare room at the end of the hallway, leaving behind an air that felt too heavy to shake off. I slumped into the armchair, rubbing my eyes, wondering how two people could turn a simple night into something that kept me wired until the early hours. I shouldn't have been surprised. Emma has always had this way of making her presence felt without saying much. She's polite, mostly, but there's a stubborn streak in her, the kind that used to drive her dad and me crazy when she was a teenager. Lila, on the other hand, is the spark Emma sometimes hides behind. I didn't know her as well, but she had this fearless energy that made it impossible to ignore her. Together, they were a storm I couldn't quite read. I remembered when Emma first moved in. I was still adjusting to the role of stepmother, trying not to overstep while also trying to be someone she could trust. It wasn't easy. There were nights like this back then when I felt more like an observer than part of the family, watching her grow, laughing with friends, sometimes skipping meals just to finish a project. And Lila had been there for most of it, always at Emma's side. They shared secrets and glances, stories I wasn't allowed to hear, and a language of jokes I didn't get. The house itself seemed to reflect the tension. Morning light spilled through half-closed blinds, casting uneven shadows across the living room floor. The kettle hissed in the kitchen, a small, steady noise that suddenly felt too loud. Every little sound reminded me that I was still present, still aware, still waiting for whatever they were planning next. And maybe that's what unsettled me the most. I couldn't tell if it was curiosity or anxiety keeping me near. Part of me wanted to knock on their door, check if they were okay, but another part hesitated. I didn't want to intrude. Not really, but I also didn't want to be left out of whatever had unfolded during the night. There was history between us all, of course. Not scandalous or dramatic, just quiet complexities. Shared dinners, half-heard confessions, laughter echoing from one room to another. Moments where I felt like I was almost a part of their world, and then moments where I realized I was standing outside it entirely. That push and pull was familiar, comforting in a strange way, and yet exhausting. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam curling like smoke in the sunlight, and sat by the window. The thought that refused to leave me was simple. Last night had shown me a side of them I didn't fully understand, a side that might keep me awake again tonight. And somehow, deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to miss it. By late morning, the quiet in the house felt almost heavy, like it was pressing against my shoulders. Emma and Lila emerged eventually, laughing softly as if the chaos of last night had never existed. But I noticed the small details. Emma's hair was mussed, her sleeve caught on a chair, and Lila kept brushing imaginary lint from her jeans. They were hiding something, and it wasn't hard to guess. I tried to act normal, poured them both a cup of coffee, and asked about their plans for the day. Emma smiled, polite but distracted, while Lila tilted her head and stared at her cup as if it might answer her questions for her. I wanted to press, to ask what had kept them awake all night, but something held me back. The last thing I wanted was to come off as nosy or intrusive, yet the curiosity gnawed at me anyway. The tension wasn't just theirs. I could feel it in myself, a strange mix of irritation and fascination, of wanting to step in and knowing I shouldn't. There's something about watching someone you care for, or maybe just notice deeply, get tangled up in their own world. You want to help, but you also want to see them for who they really are, unfiltered. Emma suddenly mentioned a minor argument with a neighbor, and Lila jumped in, laughing too loudly, deflecting. The way they bounced off each other, teasing but protective, made me feel like I was only half present in their conversation. I realized I was seeing patterns I shouldn't, reading meanings into small gestures, a hand lingering on a doorknob, a glance that held more than it let go. And I couldn't tell if it was intuition or paranoia. There was also a subtle undertone of guilt I hadn't noticed before. Lila seemed unusually careful around me, but not in the usual polite way. More like she was aware of a boundary I hadn't articulated, and that awareness made her restless. Emma, meanwhile, alternated between openness and retreat, sharing stories about her week, but skipping over details when she sensed I was paying too much attention. At one point, I caught Emma in the hallway, mid-step, hesitating as if deciding whether to talk to me or turn away. That hesitation, that tiny pause, made me acutely aware of the invisible line between us, a line neither of us had ever defined. And I knew that whatever had happened last night, whatever secret was floating between the three of us, it wasn't over. By noon, the house seemed quieter again, but the tension lingered, almost tactile. I sipped my coffee and tried to focus on work, but my mind kept returning to small, unanswered questions. A laugh shared too long, a glance that lingered, a whispered conversation in another room. All of it pointed to a story I wasn't fully allowed to see yet. And just as I was about to tell myself to drop it, I heard it, the sound of hurried footsteps coming from upstairs, followed by a door closing a little too quickly. I froze, because somehow I knew that whatever was about to happen next would pull me in deeper than I expected, and there would be no easy way back. The rest of the afternoon dragged on in a strange haze. Emma and Lila had settled into the living room, their voices softer now, more conspiratorial. I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to sort through some paperwork, but I wasn't fooling anyone, especially not myself. Every time their laughter spilled through the doorway, my chest tightened. It wasn't anger or frustration exactly. It was curiosity, mixed with a nervous anticipation I couldn't quite name. Emma leaned back on the couch, stretching her legs lazily, and Lila nudged her with a playful grin. "You really think he noticed anything?" Lila whispered, though I caught the words anyway. Emma's smile faltered for just a second, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. I wanted to ask what they were talking about. I wanted to step into the room and demand answers. But instead, I sat frozen, sipping my coffee and pretending not to listen. I could feel my own pulse, loud in my ears, as the air thickened with unspoken things. Then Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and quickly hid it under the couch cushion. Something about the gesture made me pause. A secret, clearly, and one they weren't ready to share. Lila caught my gaze for a brief second and smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a knowing one, like they were daring me to figure it out. I looked away, pretending to be absorbed in my paperwork, though my hands were trembling slightly. I realized, slowly, that last night hadn't been random chaos. They'd been performing, testing boundaries, and I'd walked right into it. I could almost feel the invisible threads connecting us, delicate, tense, fraying at the edges. I wanted to pull back, to leave the room and claim some distance, but my curiosity anchored me in place. The sky outside had begun to darken, clouds rolling in and brushing shadows across the walls. It made the room feel smaller, closer, almost suffocating. I noticed Emma's gaze linger on me, fleeting before she looked away. Something had shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my stomach knot. And then, as if on cue, Lila said, "You've been quiet all day. Don't tell me you're bored already." Her tone was teasing, but there was an edge, sharp enough to prick at something inside me. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Silence stretched, heavy, and I realized that the balance of control had shifted. Suddenly, the moment felt fragile, electric, like the house itself was holding its breath. A single misstep, a word, a look, even a sigh, could change everything. And I couldn't shake the feeling that what had started as a simple, sleepless night was about to reach a point I wasn't prepared for. Because in the quiet, shadowed corners of the room, I could sense it. Something was about to happen that would break the rhythm of all of us in a way none of us could ignore. I didn't hear it at first, the soft click of the front door, the distant hum of tires on the driveway. I was lost in the tension between Emma and Lila, in the invisible thread that stretched taut across the living room. And then, just as I was about to stand and make some comment, anything to break the silence, the phone buzzed again. Emma's hand flew to it, hesitated, and then froze. Lila leaned closer, whispering something that made Emma bite her lip, eyes darting toward me. The way they exchanged glances sent a strange ripple through me. Something had shifted overnight, something I hadn't been invited to understand, and suddenly, I felt more like an intruder than ever. Then, without warning, the front door opened again. This time, someone else stepped in. A man's voice, casual, friendly, filling the hallway with a warmth that clashed with the tension in the living room. Emma's shoulders stiffened. Lila's playful grin vanished, replaced by a fleeting look of calculation. It was Emma's co-worker, Alex, someone I barely knew, someone whose presence had always seemed harmless. But now, in the dim light of the late afternoon, it felt like a jolt. Alex carried himself with an ease I envied, a kind of confidence that seemed to amplify the tension already simmering between the three of us. "Hey, sorry I'm late," he said, glancing at Emma. I didn't mean to interrupt anything. His tone was casual, but the way he looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the corners, made me feel exposed. Emma's response was quick, almost too quick. "No, it's fine. We were just hanging out." Her words faltered at the end, the uncertainty creeping in. Lila, ever the observer, laughed softly, a sound that carried a hint of challenge. I realized, in that instant, that the dynamic in the room had shifted again. That last night, last hours, all of it had been building to something far more complicated than I'd expected. I tried to remind myself to stay calm, to retreat into the background, but my curiosity had become a weight I couldn't shrug off. I found myself noticing details I hadn't before. The way Emma's foot tapped lightly against the floor, the way Lila's fingers drummed nervously on the coffee table, the faintest flush on her cheeks. Every small motion carried meaning, and I couldn't stop reading them. And then Alex said something casual almost mundane, that set off a ripple of whispered conversation between Emma and Lila. The words were muffled, half lost, but the intent was unmistakable. They were hiding something from him, something from me, something I was both desperate and terrified to discover. I sat back, gripping the edge of my chair a little too tightly, feeling the tension press against me from all sides. The room felt smaller, the shadows darker, and the stakes higher than ever. The twist was clear now. Last night had been just the beginning. What had seemed like harmless chaos, like playful mischief, was now something else entirely. A delicate balance of secrets, unspoken truths, and emotions none of us were ready to confront. And in that moment, I realized I was about to be pulled in deeper than I had ever anticipated, whether I wanted to be or not. The room felt smaller than ever. Shadows pooled in the corners, the fading sunlight cutting sharp lines across the floor. I watched them, try to make sense of the subtle signals, the tension that had been building for hours, now snapping at every glance, every half-finished sentence. Emma finally stood, pacing slowly, like she was trying to buy time. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, voice low, almost trembling. Her words weren't aimed at me, not entirely, but they hung in the air between all of us. Lila shifted beside her, arms crossed, silently daring her friend to speak more. I wanted to say something, to reassure, to scold, to just break the tension, but nothing came out. I was caught in the middle of something I didn't fully understand, like watching a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, yet couldn't look away from. Alex, oblivious to the full scope of what had been happening, frowned. "Are you guys okay? You've been off all day." His question sounded simple, but in the quiet, it carried weight. Emma froze, her eyes flicking between him and me, as if she could weigh our reactions and choose which path to follow. Then Lila stepped forward, a sudden boldness in her stance. "Maybe we're just tired," she said lightly, but her eyes didn't meet anyone else's. It was one of those moments where words said one thing, but the tone, the posture, the hesitation said another. Everything was laid bare without being spelled out. Emma exhaled sharply, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's complicated," she admitted, voice breaking in a way that made my chest tighten. "Last night, everything felt different. We didn't know how to handle it." Her glance lingered on me for a fraction too long, a silent acknowledgement of the tension we'd all felt. The room held its breath. I realized then that this night, this sleepless chaos, had forced truths into the open. Unspoken fears, curiosity, missteps, and misunderstandings. All the things that had been simmering under the surface. And for a fleeting moment, I understood them in a way I never had before. But just as I leaned forward, ready to speak, there was a soft ping from Emma's phone. A message, flashing briefly on the screen before she hit it again. Her eyes widened slightly, and Lila's grin returned, small and conspiratorial. The twist was still there, lingering, reminding me that while one conflict had reached its peak, another subtle thread was still pulling at all of us. I sat back, exhaling slowly, feeling the tension ease just enough to notice the fragile bonds stretched across the room. We hadn't solved everything. The mystery wasn't gone, and neither were the emotions, but something had shifted. Eyes met, silent acknowledgments passed, and the house seemed to breathe with us, holding the weight of the night and whatever came next. And even as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew one thing for certain. None of us would sleep peacefully tonight, or perhaps for many nights after. By the time night fully settled over the house, a calm had returned, quieter, softer than anything I'd felt the day before. Emma and Lila were curled up on the couch, their earlier tension dissolved into whispered jokes and half-smiles. I sat in the kitchen, nursing the last of my cold coffee, finally allowing myself to exhale. The events of the past 24 hours had forced something out into the open. Unspoken truths, misread glances, small misunderstandings that had grown into bigger, heavier moments. And in a strange way, it had brought clarity. I saw them both differently now, not just as my stepdaughter and her best friend, but as individuals navigating a world of emotions and choices, just like me. Emma glanced my way and caught me watching. There was no mischief in her eyes this time, only the faintest shadow of acknowledgement. Lila, ever observant, noticed too, offering a small, genuine smile that made the room feel lighter. I realized that last night's chaos, the sleepless hours, the suspense and confusion, it had all been a test of patience, of boundaries, and of understanding. And somehow, despite everything, we had passed. Alex, noticing the calmer energy, finally relaxed, laughing at something trivial Emma said. The tension that had made him frown all afternoon seemed to melt away. I watched the interaction quietly, recognizing that not all questions needed answers, not all mysteries needed solving. Some moments were about connection, and sometimes just being present was enough. I poured myself another cup of tea, this time hot, letting the warmth spread through me. The house felt like home again, not because the night had been easy, but because we had all survived it together, unspoken, messy, and completely human. Before heading upstairs, I paused in the hallway, glancing at Emma and Lila. "Good night," I said softly. It wasn't just a farewell. It was acknowledgement, a bridge rebuilt across moments of confusion and tension. They murmured their own good nights, voices low and sincere, and I felt a small sense of relief, mixed with the strange realization that things had changed subtly but permanently. As I climbed the stairs, the last thought I held onto was this. Even in chaos, in sleepless nights and unanswered questions, there was a strange beauty to watching lives intersect, collide, and adjust. We didn't need to solve everything. We didn't need to explain every glance or gesture. Some things were meant to be felt, remembered, and carried forward quietly. Lying in bed, I closed my eyes, letting the soft hum of the house settle around me. The night was finally still, yet in its silence lingered the faint trace of laughter, secrets, and the bonds that had been tested and strengthened, just enough to remind me that connection often comes in unexpected, sleepless ways. And for the first time since the chaos began, I felt at peace with it all, knowing tomorrow would carry its own challenges, its own stories, and maybe, just maybe a little less tension, but never a lack of life.